Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Jerry9s with yet another video in our online Firearms Academy. This video is going to be about double action semi-automatic pistols. And I think it's important that we've covered what we've covered up until now, because this is going to bring all of that together to help us figure out and clarify what can be a somewhat complex issue. Now, before we start off with tackling this issue, let me just again remind you that this is a video series that is put into place so that people who might not have a really good understanding or foundation in firearms have a place to go and learn the basics. And so if you know anybody who might want to start down that road, go ahead and maybe tell them about this video series, and hopefully it's something that people get a lot of use out of. As far as the channel goes, if you look down below, you'll notice in the description there are a couple of different ways in which you can support the channel. I'll talk about those at the end of the video a little bit as well. Let's just remember that we talked about the fact that a single action firearm, the trigger only has the ability to release a spring, essentially, and a double action firearm, especially in our last video about double action revolvers, the trigger has the ability to both create and store that energy and then release it. But there is something else going on with those trigger pulls that I really want to make clear. And so before we move on with our semi-automatics, let's go back to a handgun that we saw in our last video. This is that .22 Caliber Revolver. I do want to go ahead and just check and verify that in fact every casing that is in here is a dummy casing. We'll go ahead and continue on. Remember, it isn't just about the type of firearm, but also double action and single action provides us with two very different trigger pulls. Let me go ahead and demonstrate those now. That double action trigger pull is a really long, relatively speaking, trigger pull that both cocks, watch the hammer, and then finally releases the hammer for the shot. A single action trigger pull, which I can replicate here, is rather short and light and much easier to get that shot off. Now, the reason why I mention that is because the first firearm that we're going to pick up is this little Beretta double action semi-automatic pistol. Now, it has no magazine, you can see that, and we'll go ahead and check visually and physically inspect. This is a clear weapon. Now, the interesting thing about semi-automatic double actions is that at some point in firearms history, people decided that it would be a good idea to be able to take a semi-automatic pistol, and unlike the earlier semi-automatic pistols that were single action, like 1911's, Lugers are certainly a good example of a single action semi-automatic pistol, somebody said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we had the ability to take the firearm at a position of rest, especially with that hammer being forward, and be able to go ahead and pick it up, and as long as it were safe to do so, squeeze the trigger and get a shot off. And you'll notice that here we have a double action trigger pull. This is a double action semi-automatic. The problem is that, as I just demonstrated with that revolver, is that with a traditional double action semi-automatic pistol, you wind up being presented with two very different trigger pulls. The first one is if we have the firearm in this position where the hammer is forward and the gun is, again, at rest, I have this relatively long, relatively heavy trigger pull. And then, of course, the firearm discharges. Semi-automatics do what they do. The action cycles, if I can get the action to cycle here, the action cycles, and now notice that now my hammer is back, and now I am presented with that lighter and much shorter single action trigger pull. So we have, again, very different trigger pulls. And this can be a problem. Firearms, almost by their very nature, were designed to be used in times of stress, whether it be battle, whether it be hunting for food, whether it be self-defense. Now, obviously, we have other times when they're not stressful, there's target shooting and all that other good stuff, but primarily this is why they were designed. And while I do understand some of the thought process behind wanting to have a pistol, in this case we're talking about pistols, that I could just draw and fire without having to work around a safety device like any good single action pistol will have, because it does have that very light, very short trigger pull. Without having to work around that safety device, draw the gun instinctively and fire it. But the problem, of course, is exactly what I just demonstrated. Now you're dealing with two different trigger pulls. Is this necessarily a horrible thing? No. There are a lot of great designs out there that are double action, semi-automatic pistols, and you know what, they've been very successful. The Beretta M9, which the US military used for many, many years, is an example of what we call these double action semi-automatics. Sometimes you'll hear them called TDA or traditional double action. Sometimes you might even see them denoted in writing as SA/DA, meaning, or DA/SA, meaning double action for the first shot and then single action for each subsequent shot in that string. And again, a lot of these firearms are out there. A lot of them have been used to great effect over the years, and they're not necessarily inherently unsafe. It's just that they require, in my opinion, they require a much more dedicated user who is going to really understand and train to the reality that that first trigger pull you get out of the holster is going to be radically different than the second and subsequent trigger pulls. Additionally, if we do have to fire in times of stress, I don't know that I necessarily want to have to remember that my gun has cocked itself if it hadn't been cocked before. So, what we had was, to some people's mind, and I think it's a very valid concern or problem. And so herein enters really the game changer, and it's been kind of the elephant in the room in our conversations. I've mentioned the gun a couple of times, and it's sort of the elephant in the room in a lot of conversations around the tactical or combat pistol, and that's the Glock, okay? Here we have a Glock 17. This is their full-size 9mm version, and it does have an empty magazine, and I am physically and visually inspecting. This gun is clear. So, the Glock tried to give us the best of both worlds. It gave us, and when best of course is subjective, but thinking about what I just said, having a firearm that gave us all of the capacity and all of the easy magazine changes, the flat profile of a semi-automatic, but yet a really, really easy manual of arms, meaning easy to put into operation, easy to work with, and a gun that doesn't hold a lot of surprises for you. It's not cocked sometimes, uncocked other times. It's not on safe sometimes and off safe sometimes. It is, in fact, in a lot of ways, really the perfect combination of what we like about revolvers, the simplicity of a revolver, the ability to have a very consistent trigger pull, and yet at the same time, all the things that I already mentioned about a semi-automatic. So, with the Glock, what they did is they provided a pistol that kind of gives you the same trigger pull every time. And I say kind of because that's kind of true and kind of isn't. We'll talk about that. But if we notice, and I'll come back over here, highlight the gun. Here we have a Glock, it's already been cleared. We're going to go ahead and simulate a shot. Bang! Notice how much my trigger finger moved. The gun cycles, the trigger resets. You'll notice it's come back all the way forward. Bang, I do that again. Subsequent shots. And I am getting a very similar trigger pull, very consistent for every round fired. Having said that, the Glock requires, like a lot of other double-action semi-automatics. Now, what's happening there is the Glock, when it's firing, is waiting for the action of the slide. You'll notice that trigger stayed back before the trigger returns and resets to its ready to fire position. Okay? The reason I mentioned that it's consistent but kind of isn't is because if you really dissect the Glock trigger pull, watch this. I pull the trigger, the gun goes bang, everything resets, and then notice this. Hear that click? Guess what? I don't have to come all the way forward, and I can get another shot off. So even though Glock set out to provide a consistent trigger pull, I really think it's much more correct to say that Glock provides the opportunity to have a more consistent trigger pull if you release the trigger all the way between shots. Now that can be done very quickly, obviously, but I do think it is an important thing to mention and notice. Now some people love the fact that in the subsequent shots in that string, Glock kind of allows somebody with a trained trigger finger to hit that reset and have a higher rate of fire. I'm not slamming it, I'm just saying that please understand that, sometimes Glock is the default. A lot of people in my position as a firearms instructor, when they're asked, what kind of gun should I get to carry for protection or have in my home or whatever, a lot of people just go, oh, get a Glock 19, it's perfect. And that's not necessarily horrible advice, but it's important to remember that you have to become intimately familiar with every one of your firearms. So again, we have the traditional double action only, or DASA, or SADA as it's sometimes called. This gun cocks itself after its first round. This Glock kinda decocks itself after every round, and we call this double action only. Now Glock goes one step further, and they actually did go one step further. They call this their safe action trigger system, and part of that safe action trigger system is the fact that you get that more consistent trigger pull and the gun isn't cocking itself. But additionally, there's this little safety lever within the trigger, kind of a trigger within a trigger. Okay? I'm not going to go into that too much, but that is another safety element to the gun. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Glock kind of gives you the revolver-esque ability to not have that safety lever messing around. Does that mean that the Glock doesn't have safeties? Absolutely not. It certainly does. There are 3 really good internal safeties here. I could load this and drop it off a building. It's not going to go bang. It's a very, very safe firearm. Don't get me wrong. It just doesn't have those external safeties to manipulate like most American revolvers do. The reason I say that is because just about every revolver we see here in the United States doesn't have a safety lever, but there are some, especially of European design, that have. So this is the Glock safe action trigger system. Double action only for the most part. Provides you that consistency, but not consistency all the way. Smith & Wesson took notice, and by the way, everybody took notice of what Glock did in the early 80s when they released this pistol, because it really was a monumental shift in how people thought, and it was a monumental shift in the ability for law enforcement agencies, military, and people on the private side of the equation to again sort of mash the best of both of those worlds together. Smith & Wesson is an American company, Glock is an Austrian company, and before the 1980s, Smith & Wesson owned the law enforcement firearms market in the United States. They just owned it outright. That was it. Almost nobody didn't use a Smith & Wesson. Glock came along and in a period of like 5 to 7 years turned that around to where Glock now owns that market. Smith & Wesson did respond. They responded with their own family of double action only semi-automatic pistols. And I do believe that this is a little bit closer to the concept of true consistency in the sense, and by the way, I own like 7 Smith & Wesson double action only pistols, and this is true for all of them in that when I have the shot that goes off, it goes off, and then we get a cycle of operation, and then the trigger resets, and then I do have true forced consistency. In fact, if I try to, listen for a link or whatever, I'm not going to get anything until I get right to the front of that trigger travel, okay? Again, you see that it's not allowing me until we get all the way out there. So That is a much more consistent, but please, at this point, I'm kind of splitting hairs. I'm just trying to show you that more than one company makes a double action only type firearm. Even in this case, it's important to notice that the at-rest position where we're going to be carrying the gun and where it's ready to fire, notice that the hammer is actually farther back than at the point of full ignition. The only difference here is that we can see what's going on with this hammer versus the Glock, where this is what's called a striker-fired pistol, which means that there's no external hammer. There's a spring in here that operates that firing pin that smacks the back of that cartridge, and we get a bang. So again, double-action semi-automatic pistols. It is a conversation that definitely is worth having, but it's also a conversation that is a little bit confusing, or it can lend itself to a little bit of confusion, because we start off in the early days. We had double action semi-automatic pistols that were only really double action for that first shot. Then they'd cock themselves during that normal course of operation, and then you were left dealing with two different trigger pulls. Then came Glock, and with Glock we got consistency, but I will argue not full consistency, and that can be taken as both a positive and potentially a negative depending upon how you're looking at it. I really think that it's kind of a good way to go, because it gives a skilled shooter a way to be able to take advantage of something that's going on mechanically to up their rate of fire. But yet somebody who is maybe not as skilled, doesn't have as much practice with a gun, I've seen in all of my training and all the time I've spent on the range with new shooters, with a Glock they tend to take advantage of that full range of motion on the trigger. So again, I'm not trying to make a mountain out of a molehill, I'm just talking about it. Since then, we've seen a slew of firearms out there, and really the emerging sort of norm has been these double action only, striker fired usually, sometimes hammer fired, semi-automatic pistols that are truly double action only. They give us a consistent trigger pull from shot to shot, and they kind of right now, I believe, represent the pinnacle of firearms manufacturing technology. Some examples of these are like the Ruger LCP, which is a smaller pistol, the Ruger, what do they call it, the Security 9, certainly the excellent Smith & Wesson Shield pistol, and certain versions of their modern M&P line, that stands for military and police. They have many options that are double action only, striker fired. Heckler & Koch, the German company, makes very high quality firearms. Kel-Tec here in the United States. Sky, if you're looking for a bargain brand. Notice I didn't say cheap, I said bargain. And the list goes on and on. So in the world of semi-automatic double action pistols, again, we've got everything from sort of the beginning, which was guns that were only double action for the first shot and then cocked themselves. Kind of what changed everything was the Glock, and then the difference between the Glock and everything we have in modernity is very small. So with that, please go ahead and like and subscribe if what you've seen here is of interest to you. Please go ahead and comment. I really love hearing what people have to say. I try to answer every one of those. And again, if there's something here that you see and this is something that you think you want to continue either for yourself or for someone else in your life, please consider, funding the channel in one of the couple of ways in which I provided. Now, in terms of what's coming next, well, I'm going to have to think about that. This is episode, I think, 9 now of the Online Firearms Academy. We've gone through some very basic safety rules up to, semi-automatic handguns, revolvers, double action, single action. I think what I'd like to get into in the next few videos is maybe taking a deeper dive into the nomenclature. I think certainly having a better conversation about ammunition. We did do an ammunition episode as well, but I think maybe a deeper dive into that. And then from there, maybe get into something such as, getting the gun loaded and unloaded. We went through this a tiny little bit during the introduction to revolvers and introduction to semi-automatics, but those are going to be upcoming videos that are all on their own. Whatever the next video is in the series, I'll go ahead and put it here, and so you can go ahead and follow along. Hey, this is Jerry9s with the Online Firearm Academy. I'm having a great time doing this. I certainly hope you are too. Again, let me know about it, and at the end of the day, be safe. Thanks for your time, and God bless America.